Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're doing fine. Today's topic of the video is gonna be object creation. In the last video, I showed you only one way of creating an object, which is literal notation. It's basically comment a limited list of 0 or more pairs of property names and associated values, enclosed in curly braces. But what if I told you there are more than one ways of creating an object? Those methods are Object Constructor, Constructor Functions, Object.create method, using ES6 class syntax and Singleton pattern. Now let's begin with the first one. Now this right here is Object Constructor. Syntax is kind of easy, you just have to use a new keyword following up with Object Constructor function. Now the difference maker here is that if you give this function anything other than null or undefined, it's gonna create an object wrapper for the given value. It's gonna create a built-in object for the given value. Let's say if I give it string, it's gonna create a string object. But it's gonna be a bit of a stretch if I talk about built-in objects just for now, because it's topic for the future video that's gonna come soon. So I'm just gonna skip it just for now, and just for your information, that's the main difference between literal notation and object constructor. And the thing is, you can't predefine properties directly inside Object Constructor function right here. You can't do something like this. There is no way of doing this. You just have to create an empty object like this and then assign properties. Now let's move to the next one. Now this is a constructor function. Constructor functions in JavaScript are important part because they are basically helping us eliminate code repetition and write less code. Plus, it's helping us to create many instances of objects using less code. So basically, we can create one blueprint, like this one, and create many instances with just one line of code. So what we're doing here is simple. Now, this keyword might be confusing at first sight, but it's topic for another video. As I mentioned, there are many things that we're not going to talk about in this video to not stretch the video for no reason, but to give you a brief overview of what this keyword actually means. It's basically an object that owns the code. But in this case, this represents a newly created object, an instance that we're going to create according to this blueprint, to this constructor function. Now, this keyword is an object that we create right here. So we are setting the newly created object's mark property to a given argument, to given value right here. So in this case, Toyota. So the newly created object's mark property is gonna be Toyota. Now, let me show you as an example. Let's see car. As you can see, it has mark property and the value is Toyota, like I did here. But we don't see two methods, go and drift. Now, the thing is, we used prototype. Now, prototype, just as this keyword, is a subject for the future video that we're not gonna go in depth just for now. But for the sake of understanding prototypes as simple as possible, I'm just gonna tell you that prototypes are technically parent classes. But don't get confused. There is no concept of class in JavaScript. It's not class-based language, it's prototype-based language. Prototypes are technically the same. There are differences between these two approaches, but since it's possible to use JavaScript constructor function like class, you can refer to constructor function as a class. So you can call this a class, a car class, and you can call this go and drift methods its parent class methods, and its prototype a parent class. So what we're technically doing here is creating a parent class with two methods, drift and go. So this instance does not directly have go and drift method inside an instance as a property, but it inherits go and drift method from its parent class, just like the car2. Let me show you right here, car2. So this object does not have go and drift method directly inside as a property, but they both share these two methods from their parent class, from their prototype, because we declared prototype.go to be a function, which is right here. This proto is parent class technically. So that's one cool thing about prototypes. The other cool thing is we are not repeating the same methods inside every instance. As I mentioned, we are eliminating code repetition. So that's about it for constructor functions just for now. Let's move on to the next one. Now, this right here is Object.create method. Now, you might get confused at first sight, just like in the previous case on this keyword and prototype, because you don't know what object means. But just for now, I'm just going to tell you that it's a global object with built-in methods that we're going to use. And one of the methods of this global object is create method. Now, this create method is going to help us create objects more precisely on the property level, and I'm going to show you how. Now, in this case, we are giving this create method an empty object. Now, keep that in mind. Create method has to have something as a first argument. It's either null or empty object, or the prototype of your created constructor function. So, basically, the first argument for the create method is a prototype to newly create an instance. So, whatever you put right here is going to be set as a prototype of the newly created object. If I say null, it's not going to put anything as a prototype, and that's the difference. So let me show you right here. If I do something like this, it's going to create an empty object with no properties and methods, but its parent class is going to be global object. But if I do something like this, let my second equal to Object.create null, what it's going to do is it's going to create empty object, but in this case it has no prototype, it has no parent class, and it has no methods inherited from global object.prototype. Now, just to tell you what object.prototype actually is, it's parent class for every created object in JavaScript, except the ones created with Object.create null. Now, this prototype has many methods. For example, hasOwnProperty is prototype of. These methods are going to be handy in the future as a JavaScript developer. You'll get to know these methods very soon, but just to show you a small example, I'm just going to use hasOwnProperty, which returns true if the given argument is the property of an object. Now, in the case of my object, let's add some property. Or actually, I'm just going to do it right here. Let's get car.hasOwnProperty, and let's check if the car has something like color. And it says false because car object has nothing like color property. Now, if I do something like this, let's say mark, it returns true. Now, if I do the same thing on, let's say, let my object equal to Object.create, but with null, let's say my object.hasOwnProperty. As you can see, it's returning an error because this object does not have anything like this method. In the previous case, hasOwnProperty was a method of a prototype of this object because the prototype of this object is Object.prototype, a global parent class, which has many methods. But we created the new object with null as a prototype, so code can't find anything like this method. It's going to return error. This object has no parent class, and it can't find anything like this method. Now, don't get confused. Whenever I did something like this, car.hasOwnProperty, what the code actually did was it tried to find hasOwnProperty inside this object right here. Now, it couldn't find hasOwnProperty inside this object, this particular object, because it doesn't have any. As you can see, it only has mark, model, speed, and go and drift. But, as you can see, this object has parent class, it has prototype. So, it went to find the hasOwnProperty method inside this object's prototype. And it was successful. It found it and returned this function's return value, which was true in this case. So that's the thing about creating object with a null argument. You usually don't use it because you need object to have methods derived from Object.prototype. Now let's move on to the next part of Object.create, which is Object.create with the second argument, which helps us predefine properties inside this method. So in this case, we just created empty object and then assigned properties using .syntax. But in this case, we can create predefined properties like this. So syntax looks something like this. You just have to give this function a second argument, which is object. And inside an object, you are naming properties on the left side and you are assigning objects and then value keyword and then the real value. Now, this might be confusing, and you might be thinking, why not do something like this? Let's say Toyota. The thing about this object right here is that we can control this property more precisely using this object, because not only we can give this a value, which is Toyota, we can also tell the code to, let's say, writable. If the code should be able to change value of this property. And if I say false, we won't be able to change the mark of car2. Let's do it right here. car2.mark equals to something else. It's not going to change it. It's going to stay the same. But the thing is, if I don't write writable false, the default value for writable is false anyways, so it's going to stay the same. So if I use this second method for predefined properties, the writable will be assumed to be false, so you won't be able to change it. So keep that in mind. But the thing is, this right here, writable, and all the other attributes that we can give it is the subject for the future video, just like other things that I did not go in depth. So keep that in mind. We're just gonna tell you that you can change property more precisely using Object.create and using the second argument right here. So that's about it just for now. Let's move on to the next step. The next method to create JavaScript object is using ES6 class syntax. Since the release of ECMAScript 6, for short ES6, you can use class syntax to write constructor functions. Now, this right here is basically a constructor function. But if you're familiar with OP, which is Object-Oriented Programming in another language, the things might be like a little easier to understand, like constructor and class and the name of the class. So basically what we're doing here is we are creating separately these things. Since the release of ECMAScript 6, ES6 for short, you can use class syntax to write constructor functions. Now this basically here is a constructor function. Now in this case, we are assigning properties right here inside constructor method. Now this constructor method is a built-in method for the class syntax, but go and drift are our custom methods, which is basically taking these two methods into prototype. So this right here is exactly the same as constructor function right here. These two are exactly the same. But in this case, we are chaining prototype like this. We are writing .prototype.go. But in this case, it's a synthetic sugar. You just have to write go and assign the return value right here. So most people prefer the old way, but some people, including me, prefer the class syntax, which is this. It makes things more simple, it makes it more understandable, and it's a great way of writing code in general, and it's a recommended way. Now, just to prove that this does exactly the same thing, let me show you right here. Let me comment this thing down and run the code. So now the result should be exactly the same. Now there are three properties, which is mark, model, and speed, and it has two prototype methods, which is drift and go. Now to prove that these methods are available, I'm going to run them. And as you can see, they are available. So these two methods are basically a parent class methods. They are not directly inside an object. And these two properties are inside an object. But disclaimer right here, before you start using class syntax in every one of your code, keep that in mind that ES6 is not available for every version of all browsers. Some browsers on old versions are not able to understand this class syntax. For that, some people like to use Babel, which is JavaScript transcompiler, which basically transforms this code into this one. So keep that in mind and let's move to the next one. The last method is simple, but yet it's not a recommended way of creating an object. It's basically synthetic sugar. But as you can see, it's not reusable. You can't reuse this code for other instances. In this case, what we're doing is we're creating an anonymous function and we are using a new keyword to create an instance immediately right here. So we are assigning properties right here and we can't use prototype as well. So basically, we are just creating an object and we can't use this function anywhere inside the code to create another instances. This code is just going to create one particular instance. Let me show you. Plus, in this case, go and drift methods are directly inside an object. They are not derived from the prototype. They are not inherited. So that's about it for this video. I hope you liked it. You can use any way as you wish, whatever suits your needs, and see you later.